fellow students in the class. Now you're asking.
Why? The best way to teach is to have no fault. The sense is that you use every possible way of doing it. That's the only way I can see to answer that. So to catch it. During the time when the fellow who was interested in history is being bored by the abstract mathematic, on the other hand, the fellow who likes the abstraction is being bored another time by the history. If you can do it so you don't bore them all the time, perhaps you're better off. I really don't know how to do it. I don't know how to answer this question of different kinds of minds with different kinds of interests.
What hooks them on? What makes them interested? How do you direct them to become interested? One way is by a kind of force. You have to test the schools. You have to take that examination. It's a very effective way. Many people go through schools that way. It is maybe the more effective.
Sorry.
After many years of trying to teach and trying all different kinds of methods, I really don't know how to do it. When I was a boy, my father telling me things, so I tried to tell my son things that were interesting about the world.
When he was very small, I used to block him
About the world.
When he was very small, I used to block the world. When he was very small, I used to block him.
Bed. When he goes to bed, I tell him stories, and I'd make up story about little people that were about so high would walk along. They would go on picnics, so they lived in the ventilator, and they go through these woods, which had great, big, long, tall, blue things like trees, but without leaves and only one stalk, and they were an all, and they had to walk between them and so on. And he'd gradually catch on that was the rug, the nap of the rug, the blue rug. And he loved this game, because I would describe all these things from an odd point of view, and he liked to hear the stories, and we had all kinds of wonderful things. He even went into a moist cave where the wind kept going in and out. It was coming in cool and went out warm and so on. It was inside the dog's nose that they went. And then, of course, I could tell him all about physiology by this way and so on. And he loved that. And so I told him lots of stuff, and I enjoyed it because I was telling him stuff that I liked. We had fun when he would guess what it was and so on. And I have a daughter, and I tried the same thing. Well, my daughter's personality was different. She didn't want to hear the story. She wanted the story that was in the book repeated again and read to her. She wanted me to read to her, not to make up stories. That's a different personality. And so if I were to say a very good method for teaching children about science is to make up these stories of the little people who it doesn't work at all. Who it doesn't work at all. Who it doesn't work at all. On my daughter. It happened to work on my son.
identical theories, two theories, suppose you have two theories, A and B, which look completely different psychologically, different ideas in them and so on. But that all the consequences that are computed, are exactly the same. They say they even agree with experiments.
The point is, though, that the two theories, although they sound different at the beginning, have all consequences the same.
It's easy usually to prove that mathematically by doing a little mathematics ahead of time to show that the logic from this one and this one will always be a corresponding consequence. Suppose we have two such theories, how are we going to decide which one is right? No way.
Not by science.
Because they both agree with experiments to the same extent, there's no way to distinguish one from the other. So two theories, although they have deeply different ideas behind them, may be mathematically identical, and usually people say then in science you should say one doesn't know how to distinguish them, and that's right. However, for psychological reasons, in order to get new theories, these two things are very far from equivalent, because one gives a man different ideas than the other. By putting the theory in a certain kind of framework, you get an idea what to change, which would be something, for instance, in theory A that talks about something, that you say, I'll change that idea in here. But to find out what the corresponding thing is you're going to change in here may be very complicated. It may not be a simple idea. In other words, a simple change here makes maybe a very different theory than a simple change there. In other words, although they're identical before they're changed, there are certain ways of changing one which is natural,
which now looks natural than the other. Therefore, psychologically, we must keep all the theories in our head. And every
theoretical physicist is very good, knows 6 or 7 different theoretical representations for exactly the same. And knows that that they're all equivalent.
And that nobody is ever going to be able to decide which one is right at that level, but he keeps them in his head hoping that
they'll give him different ideas for guessing.
Incidentally, that reminds me of another thing, that is, that the philosophy, or the ideas around the theory, a lot of ideas, you say, I believe there is a space-time, or there is a space-time,
There is a space-time.
or something like that, in order to discuss the analysis. That these ideas change enormously when there are very tiny changes in the theory. Change enormously when there are very tiny changes in the theory. In other words, for instance, Newton's ideas about space and time agreed with experiment
very well. But in order to get the correct motion of the orbit of Mercury, which was a
tiny, tiny difference. The difference in the character of the theory with which you started is enormous. These are so simple and so perfect. They produce definite results.
In order to get something to produce a little different result, it has to be completely different. You can't make imperfections on a perfect thing. You have to have another perfect thing. So the philosophical ideas between Newton's theory of gravitation and Einstein's theory of gravitation are enormous. The differences, rather, are enormous.
What are these philosophies? These philosophies are really tricky ways to compute consequences quickly. A philosophy, which is sometimes called an understanding of the law, is simply a way that a person holds the laws in his mind so as to get quickly at consequences. So as to get quickly at consequences. So as to get quickly at consequences. So as to get quickly at consequences.
Some people have said, and it's true, for instance, in the case of Maxwell's equations and other equations, never mind the philosophy, never mind anything of this kind, just get the equations. The problem is only to compute the answers so that they agree with experiment. The problem is to have a philosophy, argue words about the equation. That's good.
In a sense, yes and no. It's good in the sense you maybe, if you only get the equation, you're not prejudicing yourself and you'll get better.
On the other hand, maybe the philosophy helps you to get very hard. For those people who insist, however, that the only thing that's important
Is that the theory
agrees with experiment, I would like to make an imaginary discussion between a Mayan astronomer and his student. The Mayans were able to calculate with great precision, the predictions, for example, the position of the moon in the sky, the position of Venus, and so on. However, it was all done by arithmetic.
to count a certain number.
Just subtraction numbers and so on. There was no discussion of what the moon was.
There wasn't even a discussion
Of the idea that it went around. There was only calculate the time when there would be an eclipse or the time when it would rise, the full moon and when it would rise.
Therefore, and so on. Just calculate it only. Suppose that a young man went to the astronomer and said,
I have an idea.
maybe those things are going around, and there are balls of rocks, like rocks out there. We can calculate how they move in a completely different way and just calculate
What time they appear.
All right.
So of course, the Mayan astronomer would say, yes. How accurate can you predict eclipses? He says, I haven't developed the thing very far. But we can calculate eclipses more accurately than you can with your model, and so you must not pay any attention to it. The mathematical scheme is better. And there's a very strong tendency of people to say, against some idea.
Someone comes up with an idea that says, let's
Suppose the world is this way, and you say to it, well, what would you get for the answer to such and such a problem?
He says, I haven't developed it far enough.
And you say, well, we have already developed much further, and we can get the answers very accurately. So it is a problem as to whether or not to worry about philosophies behind ideas. So it is a problem as to whether or not to worry about philosophies behind ideas. So it is a problem as to whether or not to worry about philosophies behind ideas.
it's often taught as though it were a glorified version of an executive stress ball. It's a tool you want in your toolkit, prepares you emotionally to go into a new experience with a positive attitude, and you're not hauling around baggage from the past. And that's true. It actually, having focus and having your mind in the present moment is a little bit of a superpower in situations that we're all in day to day. But that actually undervalues what mindfulness really is and its true potential. It's more like the Large Hadron Collider in that it's a real tool for making some fundamental discoveries about the nature of the mind. And one of these discoveries is that the sense of self that we all carry around from day to day is an illusion.
And cutting through that illusion, I think, is actually more important than stress reduction or any of the other conventional benefits. Benefits that are accurately ascribed to mindfulness. The enemy of mindfulness, and really of any meditation practice, is being lost in thought. Is to be thinking without knowing that you're thinking. Now, the problem is not thoughts themselves. We need to think. We need to think to do almost anything that makes us human, to reason, to plan, to have social relationships, to do science. Thinking is indispensable to us, but most of us spend every moment of our waking lives thinking without knowing that we're thinking. And this automaticity is a kind of scrim thrown over the present moment through which we view everything, and it's distorting of our lives. It's distorting of our emotions. It engineers our unhappiness in every moment, because most of what we think is quite unpleasant. We're judging ourselves, we're judging others, we're worrying about the future, we're regretting the past, we're at war with our experience
in subtle or coarse ways. And much of this self-talk is unpleasant and diminishing our happiness in every moment. And so
meditation
is a tool for cutting through that. It's interrupting this continuous conversation we're having with ourselves.
So that in and of itself is beneficial. But there are features of our experience
that we don't notice when we're lost in thought. So, for instance, every experience you've ever had, every emotion, the anger
you felt yesterday or a year ago, isn't here anymore.
It arises and it passes away. And if it comes back in the present moment by virtue of your thinking about it again,
it will subside again when you're no longer thinking about it. Now, this is something that people tend not to notice because we,
rather than merely feel an emotion like anger,
we spend our time thinking of all the reasons why we like to be angry. Conversations features both this way, much more
I think the biggest role philosophy can do today is to correct or at least make us think of how we approach the problems. This is, I think, and don't underestimate this, the big role of philosophy today. To not to offer solutions, but to enable us to ask. Not to offer solutions, but to enable us to ask the right.
Does not like losing.
He had the worst team in the league, and he played a game, and
He scored the losing touchdown.
and he was very angry. And my sister
Didn't dispense to him.
the standard parenting advice. It doesn't matter if he wins or loses. What matters is how we play the game. Which raises the question: why do we keep score? Because she'd been hearing all my ideas about the infinite game, spontaneously decided to say,
Okay, so you had a behind day.
what are you going to do to make sure you have a head day next time? And by telling people that it's not a good day or a bad day, or we won or we lost, because those things are final. And in business, unless you go out of business, you haven't lost anything. But rather, it's about ahead and behind. Because when you're behind, it's not permanent. But when you're ahead, it's not permanent. And so it keeps you humble when you're doing well, and it keeps you motivated when you're... But when you're ahead,
It's not permanent. And so it keeps you humble when
you're
you're
doing well, and it keeps you motivated when you're...